Hi, everybody. My name is Miles, and I'm with Peak Performers. I'm a disability inclusion partner here at Peak Performers. My job is to educate and advocate on behalf of individuals with disabilities, particularly professionals working within our workplace as well. I'm so excited to have Winston joining us today. So, Winston experiences something called osteogenesis imperfecta, and he's going to tell us a little bit more about that particular lived experience, as well as his unique experience and perspective as a professional within our field in regards to living, working, and everything else. Winston, thank you so much for coming on. It's a pleasure to see you.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Well, Winston, I'm going to have you introduce yourself. Please tell us a little bit more about who you are and how people can get connected to you.
Yeah, so my name is Winston Clements, and I guess just to introduce myself, a couple of ways to do it would be from a personal perspective. I do have lived experience with disability. Like Miles mentioned, I was born with osteogenesis imperfecta, which is a very complicated medical term that simply means my bones are more fragile and brittle than the average person. And how that shows up for me the most is that I've experienced over 200 fractures in my lifetime, which had some challenges, especially as a young person, which I'm sure we'll speak about later. And then the other aspect of it is, I guess, from a professional perspective, I started off actually in the tech industry. So I majored in computer science, and then I went to work in technical roles for some large corporations in the financial services and management consulting space. During those career experiences that I first began a journey to acceptance of my disability, going from not wanting to be seen as disabled and wanting to be seen as normal to actually transitioning into becoming an advocate and someone who not only wants to enhance disability rights for myself, but also for other people around me. And fast forward, which again, I'm sure we'll get into, that eventually became a full time thing now. So I left the tech world behind and I now work with similar companies to the one that I work for, but now as a partner for them promoting disability inclusion.
That's quite a transformation that you've experienced right there, and quite a range of different career experiences already. Could you repeat that number? How many times did you say you've experienced broken bones?
More than 200.
Do you have a broken bone right now?
Not right now. And it's an interesting one because I'm sure other people with osteogenesis will attest. A lot of the time, it could be a crack or a hairline fracture, which because you get so accustomed to breaking bones, maybe your pain threshold and your tolerance is a little bit higher than the average person. So there's many times when I'm able to function with a hairline fracture or something that would maybe get someone else rushing to ER, just because of the frequency of bone issues I've had over my lifetime.
What does that look like for you, like in a workday kind of environment, especially if it is such a frequent kind of occurrence? Is it a significant disruption to your day-to-day schedule, or is it another trip to the doctor kind of thing? Like, how does that?
Yeah, it can be, Miles, and also not all fractures are created equal, so there's
Sure.
severity within that. Like I mentioned, some of them I'm able to still, function and get on with my day to day. Others would definitely require a trip to the hospital to get, splintered or casted or whatever needs to be done. And I will also say that a large proportion of my fractures, maybe two-thirds of them, happened when I was in that childhood stage. Because typically, this has been my experience, and a few other people with osteogenesis that I've spoken to during that childhood stage, because I guess your body and your structure and your bones are developing and changing quite quickly. There can be quite a lot of turnover of bone, and that's ideal for someone who's entering puberty and kind of growing bigger and taller. But for someone who has osteogenesis, that also presents the additional challenge of that's when your bones are at their most fragile. Probably explains a little bit why two-thirds of those incidents occurred probably by before the age of 12, 13.
you make this transition. You start off as a software developer, and I noticed that you did have an accent. So when did you come over into the United States?
So I've been in the US at this point, coming up to 4 years. So home for me is London, and that's where I spent most of my life. Although I was born in Africa too, so I've had a life that has allowed me to experience different perspectives internationally. Spending the first 10, 12 years of my life in Africa, and then moving to London around that age, and then completing most of my education, so high school and my college degree, and also working my tech career in London, and then moving to the US in my 30s. So I was part of the same graduation class as yourself. So I graduated in 2009, which was a cool time. It was a good time to graduate, but not an ideal time because globally things were very challenging with the recession and the financial crisis that was impacting most major economies, including the US and the UK. So that's something that really stands out for me in terms of me getting that first opportunity. That was really, really tough. It was tough for everyone, but as we typically see for people with disabilities, the disabled tax tends to make things that little bit tougher. And I remember it took a pretty long time, at least a year or so, for me to secure that first opportunity. And I'm sure we'll go into it further. I think there was something there about internalized ableism, which is something that disabled people experience all the time because we live in a world where you feel like people are having to make accommodations and exceptions just to allow you to participate. And I think for me, that showed up in that season, after graduating with a good degree, but then having this challenge of getting my first role. I sometimes describe it as feeling almost too grateful to be given that opportunity, to the point where when I go into that role and into that workplace, there were definitely like a bunch of accommodations that I needed to be able to perform my role to my best ability. But I was almost embarrassed, or I felt like I didn't want to be a burden to request those accommodations because I was just so grateful to be there, and I wanted to appear as normal and as low maintenance as possible.
Yeah.
So that was something that I had to unlearn over the course of my career, which eventually led me into participating in the ERGs at my workplaces and meeting other people with disabilities and just being inspired by, not just their skill, their resilience, but also how they were advocating for themselves and for others. Which fast forward, many years, that's what I try to help employees and teams do for themselves.
I remember something very similar that happened to me where I was resistant to even ask for any kind of accommodations as
Right.
well. And there was a particular moment where I was at a crowded job fair and I spoke to probably 800 people in a single day, straining to hear them the entire time. Lip reading like crazy, and I even look back at that now because occasionally, like my hearing aids won't charge at night, and I have to figure out how to make do the next day. And I
Right.
go, how did I do that? So, was there a particular moment in time that you shifted in your mind that, hey, Winston deserves this? Like, this is something that I deserve, and this is something that is meant to help me be more productive and comfortable in the workplace?
Sorry, I had lots of opportunities, but I resisted like yourself. But it took someone from, I think they called it the occupational health team for that first company that I worked for,
Mm.
who proactively came to me and said, "Hey, I'm always happy to make time for you and do a workstation review and check out, all the equipment you're using, whether that's keyboards or hardware, software, that you might need, and see if there's any way that we can optimize your workflow, so that you can work at your best." And so it almost took for someone else to kind of bring that topic, to the surface for me to feel okay about. Actually, yeah, I think I could do with, a higher desk or a lower desk or whatever the thing was, or, a wireless mouse would work easier for me because I've got limited reach with the length of my limbs. For me, that's a great example of, I guess, allyship, but also a company having a process that doesn't put all the burden on the person with a disability to be the one to self ID and to be the one to have to disclose and wave their hand and say that I need this extra thing, even though it's not an extra thing. And then the other part of it was just coming to realize that a lot of the adjustments and the accommodations that I needed were definitely very affordable for the multinational companies that I was working for. Because again, through internalized ableism, you almost believe the lie that any accommodation is super expensive and is a huge cost. For your employer, and we all know the stats that say, I believe, more than 80% of accommodations cost $500 or less, and a big chunk of those are actually free of charge. So learning these things over time kind of helped me to, I guess, unlearn what I was bringing into that situation.
Speaking of accommodations, like what does your day-to-day look like as far as like accommodative equipment in your office setup? And I guess like where would somebody even begin to kind of explore all these different tools and technologies that you have access to right now?
My accommodations list, I would say the biggest part of what I need is really around being able to access building and its facilities. So that's literally being able to get into a building because there's a accessible path to the entrance, and to the office, and then of course accessible restrooms as well, which would be a big part of facilities. I've been fortunate to work for organizations that were willing to make those changes, whether that's even to the point where one organization created a system so that I could have assistants grabbing food from the cafeteria. And then there was also like a lowered checkout desk where I could use the self-pay much easier. So things like that would be the majority of what I need. I guess in terms of the workstation itself, nothing too exciting. I think I do like things that are wireless, because that allows me to position my workstation and my peripherals in a way that might not make sense for the average person with sort of the angles and the things that I'm positioning, but it makes sense for me with how I'm able to reach across and the dexterity of my arms, for example, and how I move. And then of course now with AI, I think there's a bunch of tools that really help me out. Transcribing tools, because I'm not the quickest at typing. So that really helps me to capture information and also just to be more attentive when I'm in meetings, because I know I'm not also having to think about, I need to note down every single word that Miles said. Adaptive technology has been around for a while. Even things like meeting subscribers, and we've all used probably at some point the voice recorder on your phone just to record something and play it back at some point, or just to practice a speech or an important conversation that you're going to have. So these tools have been around in some form for a long, long time. But to your point, I think with AI, it's really, and I think this is through the AI tools being maybe widely available and becoming more mainstream, that we're able to gain inspiration from one another. Now that I feel like I'm really plugged into the disabled community, I'm always learning and seeing different use cases for how I might be able to use a tool which wasn't necessarily designed for osteogenesis imperfecta, but I could see how, Mars is using it to transcribe his meetings and think, hey, actually that would really help me out. But what really helps me to feel positive going forward is actually playing with the tools myself and actually building things. And also, for anyone listening to this, you don't have to be a software engineer like I was to have a dabble with, building your own custom chat GPT, for example, that solves a specific thing that you might be facing. I've created so many custom things on even chat GPT, even just to help me get sentiment analysis for my written communications, make sure that my emails are inclusive and my emails have a tone that either feels professional, or I could even optimize it for if I know I'm speaking to someone who might be facing neurodiversity or ADHD or rejection sensitivity, I can optimize my communication using a very simple tool that I created, just to make sure that the message lands for them in the spirit that it was intended. With the tools and finding all the nuanced use cases and how it can help me connect with partners and my team members and make them feel seen and valued and not have to overcome cognitive load just to understand my text message. That makes me feel positive that there is far greater positive use for it than there is negative.
You're a techie guy. I feel like I'm a techie guy, or at least I definitely try to be as well too. And I remember watching CES, and CES had all these various different kinds of humanoid robots that were moving around and stuff. One famously that was like kickboxing with people, which was interesting. But I remember what I was most impressed by was the simple kinds of disability advancing technologies out there, including one particular device that you could spoon feed like a little bit of your food, and it would be able to test for different allergens that people experience, such
Right.
as shellfish or peanuts and things like that. And I think that's oftentimes technology as a way of sneaking up on us for just how useful it's going to be. And we don't even quite realize the utility of it until it's here and until we start playing around with it. What would you say is next? Like within the field of accommodations and assisting people with disabilities, what do you think is going to be the next technology that really revolutionizes things and helps so many more people be able to participate and live full lives?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many tools and technologies that are out there. I think for me, it's more less than what is the next technology. It's more about what's the next kind of big, I guess, principle. And I feel like for me, it's this idea of people who don't necessarily have a technical background like we do, actually picking up the tools and actually building things out for themselves, building out custom workflows for themselves and being able to test and create solutions that would probably be at a developer level from 5 or 10 years ago, to solve a very specific thing that they have. So I like that, a lot of the providers of these tools, they're creating almost, I guess you could call them marketplaces, kind of like how you have like the App Store and the Android Store to allow people to push their solutions out into the market. And I feel like, again, by seeing what other people are doing, maybe someone who shares a lived experience that you have, it can also spark new ideas for how you could optimize for a very specific situation that you're facing. Every day I'm seeing something that blows my mind, especially if you have the same YouTube recommended feed that I have, because of the types of things that I click on. Um, but I'm really excited by the idea of people, even people of an older generation, my parents' age, going from using ChatGPT simply to as an advanced Google search to thinking, actually, how can I build something out that I can run every day to, I don't know, send an email or like, help me search for flight tickets or whatever it is.
I remember the first time that I used a tool called Earn Better, which uses AI to help people rewrite resumes. And I thought to myself, this could be such a fantastic tool for people with intellectual disabilities that would really struggle being able to put, pen to paper and actually fill out a complete resume. It allows them to better represent their experiences and overcome the barrier that we don't even realize built in, like that barrier of writing that isn't necessarily like a hard requirement for all jobs, right? Like, but it still is there. And it's exciting to me to watch these tools develop in real time that can help so many people with disabilities. I wanted to shift gears a little bit and talk about kind of the international experience. So I'm most familiar with the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, but how does that differ from the experience over in the UK, and what kinds of protections are available over there?
In the UK, they have a couple of, I guess, similar legislations to the ADA. There's the Equality Act, which I guess is not necessarily disability exclusive, but it includes disability protections within it. So disability would be one of the 9 protected characteristics within that legislation. And then there's also the Disability Discrimination Act, which is a very specific law that does exactly what it says on the tin, particularly as it pertains to employment law, make sure that people with disabilities are treated fairly within the workplace. Maybe one of the big differences that I see is with the UK legislation, they did come around initially, probably around the same time, but there have also been some pretty major updates, even up to sort of the 2013, 2015 period of time, which I think is a positive move because it also takes in the landscape of what disability looks like in this current season that we're in. And I know we just spoke about AI, and I'm sure, the next update of the Equality Act will capture things that we need to think about as far as, inclusive digital practices and things like that.
I want to kind of turn our attention back to employers and the way that we can kind of help change their minds, if you will, right? So the question I pose to you is, if you had a magic wand and you could wave it over the employment landscape in the United States, what would you do in order to change decisions or change the way that people thought about disability and inclusion?
Is just to have more disabled decision makers. Even, and I'm a part of, I partner with organizations, through my consulting company, but I'm also a board member and I work with various nonprofits and things like that. The amount of times I've seen no representation as far as decision makers, even for nonprofits that are there to create, disability advocacy in the workplace or in society, for example. It really astounds me. And, maybe on a, I guess, slightly disappointing note, I've also had the experience of being brought in to be one of those leading voices. But then when it was time to make the decision, feeling like, my lived experience was not factored into that decision. If I can say it that way. And so, an element of tokenism just to show that, yeah, we do have a diverse board, but when push comes to shove and when we need to allocate the budget or we need to make this decision, we're just going to go with, as always was. So for me, once we start having those decision makers at the highest levels of organizations in society, I feel like that can only be a good thing for representing that lived experience. And even again, going back to technology, if we have people with disabilities that are a part of those development teams and architectural teams and design teams, then it becomes much easier to shift left with our design thinking and create a universal design from the get-go and not just as an afterthought.
Imagine somebody that is 20 years old right now. They just got their first job, or they got the degree in computer science. They're looking for their first job, but they're facing barriers, possibly due to a disability like yours or another different disability. What would you tell them to motivate them and kind of help them keep pressing forward?
Yeah, I guess firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that it is hard because I'm also not someone who subscribes to positivity at all costs. Sometimes it is okay to admit that something's hard, but one of the topics that I speak about is resilience and developing systems that pick you up even when the going gets tough. And I'd say a couple of elements within that I find really helpful is, first of all, to have some level of accountability. So if it is someone who is 20 years old and they're looking for their first role in the tech industry, then you could simply buddy up with someone else who is in a similar field or on a similar journey, and hold each other accountable, even if it's a weekly check-in and say, hey, this is how many resumes I'm going to send out this week. Set that goal on a Monday and let's check in on a Friday and see how we did against that KPI. One thing that I found and I'm really a big proponent of is kind of trying to identify and discover your own hidden superpower, which sounds like a very branded way to say it, but it could simply look like even speaking to your close circle, whether that's your personal circle or professional, and saying, hey, Miles, we've had two conversations now, you and I, What's something that stands out about me that you think, you know, could be a potential talent or skill or, something that I could explore further as part of my own? Because sometimes we think that we know ourselves. I know I'm good at coding. Um, I know I'm a great athlete or whatever the case might be. But you might be surprised because a lot of the time it will be some kind of character attribute. You come across, let's say an example, Miles, you come across as someone who's very thoughtful and kind, and someone who thinks of other people and how to help them move forward in whatever journey that they're on. And, hearing those kinds of things kind of brings it to your attention. And then that way you can apply it in all the various contexts that you might find yourself, whether that's in the workplace when you do finally get that job, being someone who champions people, being someone who promotes advocacy, being someone who makes sure that, no one is having lunch in the office by themselves because you're the type of person who.
No matter how common your disability is, or even if you have a disability, but you feel like there's nobody else that experiences it like you're not alone. There are other people that are like you out there in the world. There are other people that are going through hardships or have previously experienced hardships as well, too. But it really does come down to that. It comes down to finding community, finding your tribe, finding people that you can connect with. And fortunately, I would say that the internet is full of both good and bad, but I think if there's one good thing about it is that it allows us to connect to other people who have very similar experiences to our own. So Winston, I appreciate you coming on today, but real quick, let's talk about you and your speaking work, and how different people can get connected with you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Honestly, the best and quickest way to connect with me, whether that's for speaking, whether that's, for consulting, or you just want to say hi, and become my friend, is to go on my website, which is winstonclements.com. And on there, I share a bunch of resources, that are free to download, as well as my speaking topics, for companies and events teams. And my social media handles, they're all linked on my website too. So that's winstonclements.com. Feel free to reach out or share something that really resonated for you from this conversation today.
Winston, thank you so much for coming on today. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you.